Hello, I'm Corinna Harrod and this is the Monday Night Review. Hello and welcome to episode 96 of the Monday Night Review. We're back on the London Tube. I hope you're all well. There's new merch available featuring the pod dog. I couldn't resist. I feel like in honour of Leo the podcat, there should be some cat merch at some point, but go and check it out. You can find it. I'll put a link in the show notes. You can find it through any links on my social media, but I'll also put a link in the show notes. I've spent the day, this is going to be coming out slightly late, but I spent the day at a theme park with my middle child for a school trip. It is pretty much like one of my ideas of hell. I do not like rides. I do not like big crowds of people. I have a horror of children, basically, and their ability to puke without warning. But actually, I tried to flip it and make the best of it. I am a coach in my other non-podcasty life, so I flipped it and thought about how nice it was to spend some time with my middle son. That, you know, typical middle child gets overlooked. And it was sunny. It has rained here like we need a bloody ark, and it's due to rain like we need an ark for the foreseeable future. But today it was sunny. God, what a difference it makes. What a tiny bit of sun to a sad British person is all we need to make us a completely different kind of human beings. So I'm giving you a warning from the top of this show. The victim in this story is 7, and good things do not happen to her. So if that's something you want to skip, completely understand, go ahead. I will try and give you warnings before anything really horrible happens, and I basically am going to tell you what happens once and then skip the details from then on. Also, we are back on the London Tube today. We are going to Barbican. Originally, Barbican was not called Barbican. It was called Aldersgate Street Station. So that's what I'm going to call it, because that's what it was at the time of this story. But actually, it's now Barbican. Barbican, I have a trauma related to it because I actually had a job in Barbican when I found out I was pregnant with my 3rd child. And it was a straight one tube journey from my house to Barbican, but it was about 45 minutes. And for 6 weeks, I would do that train journey twice a week with a sick bag on my lap in the absolute hell that is morning sickness. And I'm still not recovered. And I don't think I appreciated the fact that the building at Barbican is pretty phenomenal and worth going to check out if you're an architecture nerd going to London. That's my warning to you. Sources today include mylondon.com, unsolvedmurders.co.uk, British Newspaper Archive, and a lot is taken from Forgotten Child, the tragic story of Maggie Nally by Nicola Sly, who has done an excellent job, of course, of researching everything to do. This is an old case, and as I always say, I try and research from the sources, but when have newspapers ever been factually accurate? And anything to do with murder and all of that can be really sensationalised. And actually getting straight information about anything sexually related or anything to do with women can be quite difficult and involve a lot of interpretation. So if you want the full story, Forgotten Child, the tragic story of Maggie Nally is the one to look for. It's a slim number, or you can get it on your Kindles. So we're going to London in 1915, and London and the whole of Britain was in the midst of World War I, which had begun in August 1914. The city was heavily involved in the war effort, with many young men enlisting in the military and women taking on new roles in the workforce to replace them. The war had a significant impact on daily life in London, with rationing and shortages of basic goods becoming commonplace. London was also subject to frequent air raids by German Zeppelin airships and later aeroplanes, causing significant damage to the city and resulting in civilian casualties. The threat of air raids led to the establishment of air raid shelters and blackout regulations, which is where all the lights in the city were turned off at night to make it harder for enemy aircraft to navigate. Our time that we're talking about is pre the first air raid on London, not pre the first air raid on Britain, but pre the first air raid on London, so pre-blackout. Despite the war, life in London continued with people going about their daily routines as best they could. I can guarantee you that whatever happens, Londoners carry on as normal. Having lived in London through lockdown and COVID, we just carry on as normal. The city was a hub of commerce, culture and entertainment, with theatres, music halls and sports venues still in operation. However, the war had a profound impact on the city and its residents, shaping the course of its history and leaving a lasting legacy. And already by the time we're talking about, which is April 1915, you were starting to see shortages of, and I mean this literally, manpower. You were already seeing reduced services where men were signing up. It wasn't the we'll go over, whoop the Germans and be back in time for tea. It had become plain that that was not the case. And so you're already starting to see fewer newspapers even, reduced bus routes and things because men were going off to war. Now, on the 4th of April 1915, Metropolitan Railway Inspector Richard Groves went on duty at Aldersgate Street Station, now Barbican, at 7 p.m. As was usual, he started his shift with a full tour of the station, including the waiting rooms and loos. Now, the waiting rooms, as well as the loos at this time, and I'm calling them loos, they were, of course, called lavatories at the time, were separate. So male and female loos and waiting rooms. The station was quiet. It's Easter Sunday, and Groves would later estimate that around 35 passengers passed through the station between 10:30 p.m. and midnight. The last train left the station at 11:51 p.m. So Groves extinguished all the lights and, using a handheld lantern, made a final tour of the station, locking everything up as he went. Now, during the day, the ladies' loos were looked after by a female attendant, but she had finished work at 7 p.m. Some reports have it that she wasn't working at all because it was a Sunday, but some have it that she'd finished work at 7 p.m. So either or, he comes on duty at 7 p.m. He will have sort of checked the waiting rooms and loos when he gets on duty and does the full tour, but he wouldn't necessarily have gone in case there were ladies in there. He might have looked through the door or whatever, but he won't have gone back in between 7 and locking up. So the attendant had left at 7, and yeah, it was probably not at the time deemed appropriate for men to check during the hours that women might be in there. So also assumed that women probably wouldn't be up to anything nefarious enough that would need checking up on. So at 11:51, he's checking the loos to lock them up, basically. Now, there are 2 cubicles in the ladies' loos, and Groves noticed that the one on the right-hand side was locked from the inside, meaning that either someone had climbed over the partition to get out of the cubicle, which would involve during that time going over the top rather than squeezing underneath, or the cubicle was still occupied. So he knocks on the cubicle door, calls out, and hears no response. Now, the lock on the door is a penny in the door lock, and Groves is able to open this with his pass key, but something is blocking the door from the inside. So he has to really shove the door open until it was open just enough for him to stick his head round the door. The next bit is not so nice, so skip forward if you need to. On the floor of the cubicle, he sees the body of a little girl lying on her back with her head to the side, her feet towards the door, and her arms outstretched with her palms open and facing up. Contemporary newspapers' reports would say that there was a piece of clothing across her legs. We can presume that this is her knickers that have been pulled down. He also notices there's something in her mouth sticking out. So he's absolutely horrified. He realises immediately that she is dead. There is a lot of blood, and he calls the police, and then he goes back and in and attempts to revive her with resuscitation until the police arrived. Her body is still warm by the time she is taken into the police surgeon. So it must have just been absolutely devastating for him. The little girl is taken to the mortuary where police surgeon James Kearney estimates her time of death is around 10 p.m. He also discovers that the item in her mouth that Groves sees sticking out was a square of blood-stained cotton material measuring 11 by 9 inches. Kearney believes it comes from the lining of a man's waistcoat or undershirt, and he therefore thinks it's been hurriedly torn off a man's undershirt to subdue the cries of the child. The police have heard of a child reported missing, and they go to the man who's reported this child missing, John Henry Nally, and he is taken to the mortuary where, sadly, he identifies the body of his 7-year-old daughter, Margaret. This murder takes place weeks before the first air raid on London, and 2 weeks before George Joseph Smith was went to trial for the famous brides in the Bath murders. The newspapers, which, as I said at the top, were reduced at the time because of the war, focused on this sensational trial and ongoing battles overseas. So this is why Nicola Sly calls it the forgotten child murder, because it's so shocking and horrible, but actually it didn't get as much coverage as perhaps it should have done because of the time that it happened. Margaret Ellen Nally, known to her friends and family as Maggie, attended All Angels School in Paddington. She had turned 7 on the 3rd of April 1915, which was Easter Saturday. And the next day, Easter Sunday, she ate chocolate with her siblings and had lunch of stewed giblets and mutton with potatoes at about 1:30 that afternoon. I'm going to show that menu to my terribly fussy children and see how much they fancy mutton and giblets. After lunch, Maggie begged her mother, Christine, to let her go to her grandfather's house in Marylebone to tell him about her birthday and to see him and to see other family that lived on the same street. Now, this is about a 30-minute walk from Paddington to Marylebone, but Maggie had done it before with her brothers, 9-year-old Sydney and 4-year-old John Patrick. This time she goes on her own, leaving at around 3:30 p.m, though she did meet up with a couple of neighbouring children who walked past the way with her. She's dressed in her Sunday best with a pink ribbon tied in a bow in her hair, her hat. She's got a grey coat, patent leather boots on. She's looking very smart. And Maggie arrives at Carlisle Street at about 4, and Carlisle Street runs parallel to Edgware Road. She goes to see her friends, the Scotts, who are friends/relatives. They're all loosely related by marriage. So she calls this little 4-year-old Alice Scott her cousin. And Maggie says to Alice that she wants to go to her grandfather's house. Does Alice want to come too? Alice says she's just got back and she's been given a penny. So Maggie goes off to see her grandfather down the road. She goes and visits her uncle on nearby Richmond Street, who is a soldier on leave. She only stays for a few minutes, and she says to him she's going back to the Scots. Her grandfather had given her a halfpenny for her birthday, and she wanted to show Alice. So she's just she's going off. She's gone to the Scots, her grandfather's, gone to see her uncle. Then she's going back to the Scots. She arrived at, she goes back to the Scots, and the two little girls play outside on the street with other kids until about 7:30 p.m. when Alice's mother sends them to take a message to a neighbour and then to the shop to buy some safety matches. They get back, they begin to hammer out a tune on the piano, but Alice's mother's got a headache, and so she gives them a penny each to go to the sweet shop. When Alice gets home, her mother asks where Maggie was, and the 4-year-old replies, "Gone home," pointing in the direction of Church Street towards Maggie's grandfather's house. Now, when Maggie was over in this area near Edgware Road, where she has her auntie Betsy Scott, her cousin Alice, her uncle lives down the road, her grandfather lives down the road. When she's with them, she refers to her grandfather's house as home. So this makes sense to the Scots. Alice says she's gone home, points towards where the grandfather's house is. Everyone's happy. Maggie's father, John Henry Nally, had been in the area that afternoon. He worked as a caretaker at Hyde Park Mansions during the night shift. So he'd seen his daughter at about 4:30 that afternoon playing in the street. He'd gone home to get some sleep before returning to work for the night shift. He's woken at 7 p.m. by Christine being concerned that Maggie wasn't home yet, but he'd seen her playing with Alice. So he reassured his wife that she was probably still there with friends and relatives, nothing to worry about. But Christine and John would maintain throughout all of this that it was unusual for Maggie to be out past 6:30 p.m. There is some confusing in this over timing because her parents would insist that she was always home before dark. Let me think. It would get dark at about 6:30, 7 o'clock, 7:30. So they would say she always gets home after dark. Betsy Scott and the niece of the shop owner where the girls bought safety matches confirmed that Maggie didn't leave Carlisle Street until 8:15 p.m. Now, whether it was getting dark later and that threw the timing off a bit, or whether usually she didn't stay out after dark, or whether, being a newly grown-up 7-year-old, she was feeling, like she could push her limits a bit more. She'd just had her birthday, it was Easter Day, I've got a 7-year-old. They have their own will. So Christine's anxious. So she sends John to Carlisle Street and she tells him he must follow the reverse route that his daughter would have taken to get home. He gets there, he speaks to his father, who confirmed that he'd seen Maggie, given her a halfpenny, but she'd left sometime earlier. So John still isn't worried. He's convinced that his daughter has gone a slightly different route home, and his father was like, she wouldn't have gone that route, she'd have gone a different route. So the men are like, she's clearly gone a different route home, and he goes straight to work. Christine's getting more and more worried, and she goes out herself, reporting her daughter missing at Paddington Green, Harrow Road, and John Street police stations. There is no sign of the little girl anywhere. So she's getting increasingly frantic. She goes to Hyde Park Mansions to tell her husband that Maggie is still missing, and he suggests seeing if she's with other relatives, including the Scots, and then going home to see if Maggie's got there whilst Christine's been out looking. At 1:30 a.m, Christine returned to Hyde Park Mansions to tell John that their daughter was still missing. And they go home together. He's now worried as well. And it's not long after they get back that there is a knock on the door, and it's the police. And John has to go and identify his 7-year-old daughter's body. It should be noted that Maggie was missing her hat, which she had been wearing when she left home, and when Alice last saw her. A girl of her age would have been considered in a state almost of undress. Sunday, Easter Sunday at that, without your hat. And it would definitely, you see some people saying a girl of her background, maybe without a hat, but that to me seems even more likely that her mother will have made sure that she was properly dressed when she went out. So the fact that she has lost her hat when her body is found actually helps, because it means that people are more likely to have noticed a 7-year-old girl out on a Sunday without her hat. Can you imagine that now? So how did this child... I'm going to try and put a map up for you on social media, because I know if you're not a Londoner or whatever, you might get confused. But how did this child get from Marylebone to Aldersgate, Barbican? And it's a real mystery. Her mother described her as, quote, a girl who would not make friends easily, and said she had warned her about strange men. City Police Force and Scotland Yard were brought in to try and solve the case, and were confident that they would solve it quickly. They'd found some fingerprints on the waiting room door and the penny in the slot lock from the cubicle where she was found. They also had high hopes of the piece of fabric that was found in her mouth coming from the murderer's clothing, and therefore maybe a wife or a housekeeper or someone recognising it. James Kearney, the surgeon, believed that it was from the tail of a shirt. So if you think about a men's formal shirt, it often dips down at the back where it gets tucked into the trousers. And he thinks it's that bit that's been torn off. So he's hoping that, someone's going to come forward and say, oh, this bit is missing from my husband's shirt. But Christine McNally immediately tells them, when they say, we found this random bit of cloth, she says that she's given that cloth to Maggie to use as a handkerchief. And then the police find that the fingerprints that they thought were going to be so useful were in fact useless. They didn't tell them anything. They also found a halfpenny on the floor of the cubicle, and they speculate that, it was this halfpenny that was used to entice Maggie away from safety. But actually, it's more likely, if you think about it, she was given a halfpenny by her grandfather for her birthday that she was going to spend on sweets. But then her Aunt Betsy gave her and Alice a penny to share to go and get sweets. And they just spent half a penny each from that penny on the sweets. So that is probably the halfpenny that her grandfather gave her, and the likelihood is she put it in her pocket with her handkerchief, and when the handkerchief was pulled from her pocket, the halfpenny came out. So pathologist Bernard Spilsbury performed the autopsy. Maggie had eaten a small meal of meat with hair attached shortly before her death, possibly trotter or brawn. Brawn is a traditional British dish made of the meat of pig's head, cooked, jellied and eaten cold. This is a hugely contentious part of this case, because later on he would say that it was like giblets. And obviously we know that she had giblets and mutton for lunch. And he would say, well, no, she had giblets and mutton about an hour before she died. But James Kearney said actually, if she'd eaten the food really quickly because she wanted to go to her grandfather's house, it would be harder to digest. She wouldn't have chewed it so well, so it would have slowed down the digestion process. And by this, at the time, whatever Bernard Spilsbury said went. He was God among pathology. We now know that he wasn't quite as good as everyone thought he was, and especially towards the end of his career, he was definitely slipping a bit. So I haven't included the whole did she, didn't she, what did she eat, what was in her stomach, just because I don't need to. If you want all of that, you can go and read the book, because she is so great. She covers everything. But this is a huge thing. Did she eat brawn? If so, where did she get it from? Did she eat a meal that was basically exactly the same as her lunch just before she died? I don't think she did. I think she ate her lunch. That's what I think. Anyway, because he says about the brawn, 3 shops are then tracked down near Carlisle Street that sold brawn, and that out of those 3, only one stayed open past 7 p.m. But he says he hasn't seen any child that night after 7 coming in and getting any brawn. And how did Maggie get so far from home? It made sense that her killer must have taken her by train from either of the 6 stations to Aldersgate Street Station, as the ticket collector had not seen them. So this is the ticket collector at Aldersgate Street Station. He didn't see them. And had they arrived into the station, he would have had to punch their tickets and let them through the gate. And so he would have noticed them. So if they had arrived by train, alighting from the train, they would have gone straight past the ladies' loos. And as it was Sunday evening, and Easter Sunday no less, the likelihood of them being disturbed was slim to none. So they think, right, the killer has got the child. He's come in on the train and possibly left on the train, and that's why nobody at the station has seen him. So if this is the case, it also makes it unlikely that the child had been abused and killed elsewhere, as carrying a dead child that distance is too risky. So it was at these 6 stations, Edgware Road, Farringdon Street, King's Cross, Euston Square, Portland Road, which is now Great Portland Street, or Baker Street. And that's where the police focus their inquiries. That's still a lot. So they speak to shopkeepers, publicans, stallholders, restaurant owners, anyone, asking if they remember any customers with a child fitting Maggie's description on the 4th of April. And they also ran appeals in the newspapers for any sightings of the murdered child. As is the case with requests for information, they got a lot of responses, some claiming they had seen a child miles away in South London, which was impossible considering the timeline, and some constables saying he saw a man running out of Aldersgate Street Station at 10 p.m, but is unable to give a description. The best information they had came from Alice Scott and a shopkeeper near Edgware Road Station. Alice said that Maggie had walked off with an old man, and Mrs. Walker, the shopkeeper, had seen an old man giving pudding to some of the children playing on the street, and she'd gone out to say to the children, you mustn't eat that, you shouldn't take anything from strangers. And he said, oh, it won't do them any harm. But she was like, no, and shooed the children away. And she was able to recognise Maggie as a little girl who'd gone into her shop and bought a bag of sweets that evening. So we know that she was there. We know that she went in, she bought sweets. Now, sinisterly, an Italian family from Islington came forward and said that on Good Friday, so 2 days before Maggie's murder, their 11-year-old daughter had been approached by a man offering to take her to the cinema while she was out getting them a newspaper. She refused, but he was really persistent, and he persuaded her to walk with him to the tube station where he said he was meeting his sister. Now, she walks part of the way there and then she runs off terrified and gets home and tells her parents. And she describes the man as being medium height, clean shaven, fresh complexion and dark hair. He was dressed in a black coat and dark trousers with a tweed cap. The next day, Easter Saturday, 2 children on Edgware Road were approached by a man who tried to persuade them to go with him to look at some postcards. This is an awful story, but can you imagine offering modern children, do you want to come and look at some postcards? I mean, our kids don't know, they're born. 2 girls run off, but they managed to give a description of him as being short, dark complexion, dressed in dark clothes with a check cap. Sinisterly, they last saw him on the corner of Carlisle Street, which is almost exactly where Maggie was last seen by Alice. Other children come forward saying they'd also been approached by a man in a check cap. 10-year-old Mary Wallace claimed to have been offered the chance to look at some postcards, and when she refused, the man grabbed her by the arm and tried to pull her into a side street. She managed to get away with the help of her sister, and her description is slightly different. She says this man is short, pale-faced, and that she had seen him following other little girls. The police spoke to everyone working on the Metropolitan and District Railways that Sunday, but got no concrete evidence. Some say they saw a girl fitting Maggie's description with a woman, but, trigger warning, This bit's grim. The extent of Maggie's internal injuries from rape meant that the police ruled out a woman being responsible. The inquest into her death was opened on the 8th of April 1915 by coroner Dr. Frederick Joseph Waldo, who requested that the body of the little girl was placed in preserving apparatus for as long as the parents would allow, to enable possible witnesses to view the body. First on the stand was poor John Nally, who told of the evening of his daughter's disappearance and having to go to the mortuary to identify her. He then had to identify her blood-stained clothes, which must have been absolutely horrifying. He also had to account for his whereabouts on the day and the evening of the 4th, so he could be cleared of his daughter's murder. Christine was next to the stand, and she was almost incapable of doing it, unsurprisingly. She confirmed that Maggie had never mentioned anyone approaching her and insisted that the child would not have gone off with a stranger. She also had to examine the clothing, which very nearly sent her over the edge. This was not a quick end for the child. It was a brutal attack only 4 days before, and her poor mother is having to examine the clothing. It must have just been absolutely traumatizing. Betsy Scott was able to account for Maggie's movements on the afternoon of the 4th, and then Station Inspector Richard Groves told of his evening and how he had found Maggie's body. He had not seen anyone, man or woman, in the company of a little girl, which again seems to lead towards the idea that they had arrived on the train and gone straight into the ladies' loos without being seen. He'd also heard no screams or sounds, but this is not thought of as odd, as the noise from the trains would have cancelled that out. London Underground is loud now. What it must have been like in 1915, it's just a very loud place to work, I'd have thought. Probably quite a, I hate to say this, but, quite a clever place to murder someone, because it is very loud and you've got an easy escape. So this bit is horrible, so skip forward a bit. We're just going to talk about what the surgeon finds during the autopsy. So Dr. James Kearney confirmed that Maggie Nally had been violently sexually assaulted shortly before or immediately after her death, which was about 10 p.m. I pray that it was after, because the damage was so severe. He was confident that the loos was where the rape and murder had taken place. Spilsbury confirmed that she died from asphyxia, from having a foreign body forced into her mouth, followed by heart failure. He had not found figs or whelks in her stomach. We'll get to that later, but remember, no figs or whelks were found. But found an apple including pips. Maggie had not been given one by her family, so it was thought that she'd bought herself one at the shop, though some people say, obviously, the apple was used to entice her away. Then on the 9th of April, the police announce that they have someone in custody who'd confessed to murdering Maggie Nally. Eugene McGann, a soldier in the East Kent Regiment, the Buffs, told a cinema attendant that he'd killed a little girl. The police were called and he repeats his confession. He then gets taken in, and it turns out he's gone AWOL from his regiment and was then apprehended in Ashford in Kent on the 7th of April and detained, managing to escape and make his way to the cinema, where he then makes his strange confession. Once he arrives at the police station, he refuses to give any more details or anything really, except for stating that he's responsible for the murder. The City of London police sent a detective to interview him, but it soon became apparent that McGann was actually in detention and under close supervision on the 4th of April, so couldn't have committed the crime. And this was not the first time he'd confessed to a crime he hadn't committed. Years earlier, he'd gone into a London police station claiming to have killed a child by cutting her throat. No murder had been committed. McGann was not only a heavy drinker, but clearly suffering from some other issues, So he was handed back to his regiment and medically discharged from the army on the 29th of May 1915. Sadly, these sorts of confessions from soldiers were not unusual, especially during wartime when men wanted to either avoid being sent to the front to fight, or those who had been and were suffering terribly from the trauma they'd seen and suffering terribly from trauma from what they'd seen and been involved in. And so it wasn't unheard of for soldiers at the time to be confessing to things they hadn't done and to terrible crimes, but also committing crimes that they probably would never have thought themselves capable of. The only real lead that showed any promise came from bus conductor Edward Redman, who was convinced that a soldier had boarded his bus outside Gardener's shop, Chapel Street, Edgware Road, which was close to where Alice last saw Maggie. Remember, Carlisle Street runs parallel to Edgware Road. And the soldier had got on the bus at around 8:15 p.m. on the 4th of April, and he had a child matching Maggie's description with him. Now, interestingly, he's noted that this child is not wearing a hat. This is why it is of such interest. Not only does the child match her description, she is not wearing a hat, and that is why he noticed her in particular. He said they got off at King's Cross 20 minutes later. The bus conductor was taken to see Maggie's body, and he said he was sure that it was the little girl that he'd seen with the soldier. He had also been able to accurately describe what she was wearing and noted that she was, quote, snivelling. Redman had stood on the pavement with the man while they waited for the passengers to get off before Redman and before the soldier and the child and the new passengers got on, and said that the soldier appeared dazed, probably quite drunk, and he noted that the girl seemed reluctant to get onto the bus and the soldier pushed her up the steps. Redman overheard him telling the girl to shut up and thought it quite strange that they were out so late at night and she's not wearing a hat. The soldier also didn't seem to know where he wanted to go. When Redman asked, "Where are you going?" he said, "I don't know." And he said, "Well, you need to tell me because I need to issue you your ticket." And he said, "Oh, well, do you go to King's Cross?" Redman says, "Yep." And he says, "Right, well, 2 tickets for King's Cross." Redman tries to soothe the girl by offering her a dried fig from a bag he has. She won't take one, so he rummages around, gives her the largest fig that he can find in the bag and gives it to her, but she just holds on to it. She doesn't eat it. Now, maybe she doesn't like figs. I don't know. For me, that's a bit of a thing. If a child doesn't want a treat, that's a red flag, isn't it? So they get off at King's Cross, and Redman is obviously confused or concerned or whatever enough to watch them as they leave. He says that he saw them walking towards the Great Northern Railway Station, which is King's Cross Station, and stopping in front of a whelk stand, which is why it was notable that Spilsbury did not find whelks in her stomach contents. I said, I wonder if they sold brawn. I think probably no, it's just a fisherman, you know, getting the whelks, selling the whelks, getting the whelks, selling the whelks. Anyway, notably, as I said, the little girl had not been wearing a hat, and the conductor had asked the soldier, "Oh, has she lost her hat?" And the soldier was like, "I have no idea." Obviously, I mean, it's hard to say, isn't it? I accuse my husband of being vague about my children's clothing nowadays, but at this time, as I don't think I'm going too far to say it's almost men that were more bothered about women being correctly dressed than women. So if this is a father and his daughter and he's accidentally be on duty with his child got pissed, I would still expect my husband to make up some like, "Oh, it blew off and fell in a puddle," or the fact that he shrugs and is like, "Oh, no idea," is sinister to me. Now, luckily, Redman could give a good description of the soldier, who was in full uniform and greatcoat, though he appeared dirty and notably had no flashes or cap badge. So flashes and cap badge would tell people what regiment you were in and what rank you were. Where the badge should have been on his cap was some letters or numbers written in pen. He was about 30, 5'8" or 9, sallow, ill-looking complexion, brown hair, moustache, and about 3 days' growth of stubble. The police were not sold on this story, though, as Redmond had them getting off the bus at 8:40 and the police surgeon had the time of death at 10. Where were they between 8:40 and 10? They interviewed the owner of the Welt stand, who didn't remember seeing a soldier with a child. It also didn't really fit with the description of Maggie Nally, who by all accounts was a bright, intelligent child. And it's unlikely that she would be sort of sitting there snivelling quietly, having been taken against her will. She probably, by all accounts, would have said something. And the fact that they stood on the pavement with Redmond tried to cheer her up on the bus and offer her a fig. Obviously, I don't know Maggie Nally, but it sounds like she's perhaps one of those children who'd be like, I don't know this man. So that's something to think about. The account was put in the papers and witnesses asked to come forward. Redmond said that there was a couple also on the top deck of the bus at the same time. They were asked to come forward. You know, if you were on this bus on this time, can you help us? A Mr. James, who worked as a stagehand in the theatre in West End, came forward, recognising the description of the soldier as fitting a man he had seen at King's Cross Tube Station on the night of the 4th of April. Now, I couldn't find a time for when he saw this soldier. He particularly recognised this guy as he said the numbers written on the cap in place of a badge had particularly caught his attention. However, James was adamant there was no child with the soldier and no child anywhere near the soldier, who the police would now refer to as the dejected soldier throughout the investigation. But if he had seen the soldier after 10, then surely that could be a clue. I'm assuming the police checked that. And this is sometime between 8:40 and 10. Though several men had been taken in and questioned by police, some trailed by officers undercover, and over 50 men were on the case. They were no closer to finding the murderer of Maggie Nally, and it wasn't down to lack of information. The police were sifting through basketfuls of letters with theories, dreams, speculations about the case, and in an era before the internet, every lead had to be painstakingly followed up on foot. One letter of interest came from a soldier who'd been at the Grand Cinema in Edgware Road, and he'd noticed on the seat in front of him a hat matching the one missing from Maggie. He put it on for a joke and wore it for about 10 minutes before frisbeeing it, my words, not his, at some girls sitting nearby. A search of the cinema showed no hat, and no one who worked there remembered seeing the hat. I'm not sure that you would necessarily. This seemed to have renewed the police interest in the missing hat, as if finding the hat would give them a clue as to what happened to this little girl. And so they made a replica of it and placed it on Maggie at the mortuary so that any witnesses who came to identify her would perhaps recognise the hat. They thought that perhaps the murderer had taken it. At the time, they were like, why would the murderer take it? But obviously, we now know that some murderers take things as Paul Holes would call it, a souvenir, which is a much more sensible thing to call it than a trophy, as a souvenir. So they were confused. Why would this murderer take the hat? We now know that obviously it's possible that the murderer did take the hat. The hat was never found. So who is responsible for the murder of Maggie Nally? The police believed it to be a man, and someone who knew the area of Aldersgate Street Station well enough to realise that if they got off the train, they could go straight into the ladies' loos, they wouldn't see anyone, the attendant wouldn't be there after 7, and they were very unlikely to be disturbed. They also believed it would be more likely that Maggie knew the person who took her. As many of the reports had her in the company of a soldier, it was thought that perhaps her killer had been on leave from the front and was suffering with what they called at the time strain. And had returned, and so there's no way of tracking him down. The inquest into her death concluded on the 22nd of April 1915, with the jury returning a verdict of willful murder against some person or persons unknown. Her funeral took place on the 26th of April 1915, with around 40,000 people lining the streets to watch the procession from her house to Kensal Green Cemetery. Father Worsley, who took the service, commented in his address, quote, "The whole of London seems to have turned out to show the family some respect." And indeed, the family were overwhelmed with wreaths and tokens of sympathy, many that came from serving soldiers. Soldiers came to carry her from her house to the hearse that waited. Women were dropping off little posies of flowers at the house. It affected people greatly. And partly because Maggie was not the only child murdered around this time. 3 more children were killed between 1908 and 1915, and they also remain unsolved. They are Marie Ellen Bales, who was killed in 1908, Winifred Baker, who was killed in 1912, and William Starchfield, who was killed in 1914. Now, many people wanted to link all of these deaths together, but to me, they don't seem to be at all. Maggie, Marie and Willie were all the same age, and Willie had long hair that meant that he was often mistaken for a girl, though he was wearing blue knickerbockers at the time of his disappearance. So I don't think that he was confused as a girl. They were all taken from near their home or familiar places, but that's probably because kids at the time, where else are they going to be? They're going to be at their homes or in familiar places. But they're all killed by different methods. Only 2 of them are raped. Bodies are disposed of in completely different ways. I don't think they're linked. There isn't a sort of one starts and then it escalates. They're all pretty individual, horrible murders of children, but I don't think, for me, they're not linked, so that's why I'm not going into them. On the 30th to the 31st of May 1915, the first German bombs landed on London, and by the time the last air raid finished in October 1917, at least 200 people had been killed, with countless others wounded, and many had lost homes and property. If it is the case that as Alice thought Maggie was going home to her grandfather's house, and the 7-year-old was taken in the space of 200 yards. Though her parents would go on to have a further 4 children, they never got over the loss of their eldest daughter. They lost their youngest, Elsie, before the age of 1, another daughter when she was 24. And Sydney, who was just 9 when Maggie died, was killed fighting in the Second World War. Christine Nally lived until she was 85, dying in 1970, and kept a picture of Maggie on the wall of her flat until the very end. And that is the tragic story of the death of Maggie Nally. Sorry to not have a conclusion for you there, and it just shows you at the time that there are so many reasons why the war was a terrible... You think, obviously, war's not a great thing, but terrible on so many fronts, that a murder of a child, just so much else going on in the world that it becomes impossible to solve. And just such a distressing story. And that is, we've done Barbican. Our horrible trip on the London tubes is one stop further on. I hope you're all well. Do go and check out the merch. Do email me. I love your recommendations. I've got a spooky gravestone to look at from Catherine. That's going to take a lot of research, possibly a trip to Wales. But I do love to hear from you, so do send me messages. To the lovely, lovely lady who listens with her pod dog Reg, your message on Instagram made my week. So thank you. I always say, whenever I get a negative message from someone on my YouTube channel for my main business, my makeup business, I always use that as a reminder to go and send nice messages to the people that I like to listen to or follow or watch, or anyone that I think, I'm going to tell you how great you are and what a nice influence you have on my life. And to be on the receiving end of one of those messages on Instagram is very nice, because sometimes it's easy to think that the internet is a scary, horrible place. And until next time, be kind, stay safe, and always check the back seat before you drive.